I would like to introduce David Meara, who is a retired Church of England clergyman, and he's written extensively about church architecture and monuments. He published a book on the history of the sleeper trains between Scotland and England last year, and his latest book is an account of the scuttling of the German fleet in Scapa Flow, told from eyewitness accounts, including those of his uncle and his mother.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeanette, for your welcome, and good evening, everybody. It's very good to be here. I don't think I need to tell an audience like this that 100 years ago this week, an extraordinary event happened, took place here in Orkney, the scuttling of the German high seas fleet in Scapa Flow on the 21st of June 1919, Midsummer's Day. The greatest single loss of shipping in maritime history. 74 capital ships scuttled, of which 52 went to the bottom. It's an event that's still very much a part of the history of these islands. Still talked about, still having an impact, not least because the 7 wrecks that remain at the bottom of the flow have become popular dive sites and contribute to the island's economy. But beyond Orkney, I think certainly where I come from in the south of England, these momentous events are less well known. I think if you ask somebody in the street, have you heard of the scuttling of the German fleet in 1919, they'd probably look at you quite blankly. Whereas up here, it really is very much a part of your island story. And so I think this anniversary year is a real chance to introduce more people to this dramatic postscript to the First World War. I have, as Jeanette said, a personal interest in this subject because my mother's family lived here in Stromness from 1908 to 1920, because my grandfather was a customs and excise officer here in Stromness, and there they are. My grandmother in the middle, my mother on the left, and Winnie Thorpe and Leslie Thorpe, her older brother, on the right. They lived first at the south end, and then when my mother was born, moved to Melvin, halfway up Hellyhole Road by the harbour lights. There they are standing in the front garden of the house. Winnie and her older brother Leslie grew up here and went to school at Stromness Academy, or the Stromness Higher Grade School as it was then known. And that's Stromness Academy with pupils going up the lane to the school. And so it was, as members of the school, they were part of that party of Stromness school children who were invited to have a tour of the German ships on board the Flying Kestrel that Midsummer's Day in 1919. My mother, Winnie, was 9 years old. My uncle was 12. As the day dawned, full of excitement and promise, and with the weather bright and clear, they could have had no inkling just how dramatic and memorable it would turn out to be. By the early summer of 1919, the German high seas fleet had become something of a fixture in the flow, having arrived in November 1918, interned awaiting the outcome of the Paris Peace Conference. The German crews had been reduced in numbers, partly to get rid of troublemakers, but the ships were run by sailors' councils. Discipline was poor. Basic supplies were brought by ship from Germany, and they were out of radio contact. They weren't allowed either to fraternize with each other or with the islanders. So they were largely unaware of events on the mainland of Orkney, and certainly events beyond that. John Tulloch, a name familiar I know to some of you, growing up on the island of Carver, surrounded by the biggest ships, remembered that he could see and hear activity on board quite clearly. He said on a Sunday a brass band on the SMS Friedrich der Gross used to play their German military tunes when the weather was good. So those great ships became a part of my childhood days. A source of jetsament was picked up on my wanderings around the shore of my island home. And he describes how Christmas came and the German crews, far from home, nevertheless managed to sing carols and enjoy Christmas in their own way. And then, afterwards, the flotsam and jetsam from the Christmas celebrations floated ashore. Small Christmas trees and their decorations, acorns, coloured electric globes, Christmas cards, and letters written in beautiful longhand, all a great source of wonderment to me. Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, who was in charge of the interned fleet, records in his memoir that he was struck by the beauty of the flow. He said the scenery around us was really harsh and desolate, and yet this forgotten corner of earth had its attractions, its beauty. He said, in the evening light, then it was that the northern lights would cast their rays like searchlights over the clouds and light them so that the clouds were fired, and in their flaming fire rose the dark, naked cliffs of the mountains of Orkney. There is yet a God. Von Reuter decided early on in the process of internment that he'd not let his ships fall into enemy hands unless ordered to by his own government. And so he began making plans for the Scuttling, but he kept them secret, only telling his commanding officers of what was in his mind. Vice Admiral Sidney Fremantle, the officer commanding the 1st Battle Squadron, didn't keep von Reuter informed about the negotiations, and in fact took his ships out on torpedo exercises in the Pentland Firth on the 21st of June because of the good weather. And so the fates conspired to present von Reuter with the perfect moment to scuttle his fleet and redeem his country's honour. For the Stromness school children, the morning dawned fine and bright, and they prepared for their treat, blissfully unaware of all the tensions and the humiliations and the confusions of the previous 7 months. It was going to be a day to remember. Leslie Thorpe, my uncle, wrote a detailed account of the day afterwards in his diary and here in a letter to his father. And I've got both of those here with me. There's the letter and his diary with the pencil account in it. He takes up the story. Went down to see the German fleet. Everyone came to school about 9:45 a.m. and we marched to the Flying Kestrel, which was at the new pier. The Flying Kestrel was a tug from Liverpool used to supply water and general stores to the British ships in Scapa Flow. The crew list, as recorded in 1915, was headed by Thomas Davies as master, together with a crew of about 21. Most of the crew came from Liverpool, and only a handful were native Orcadians. Only the Stromness senior school classes were being taken on the trip. The infants were left behind. And so they marched down to the pier in class order between, we don't know, as far as I know, precisely how many children, but it's around about the 200 mark. Leslie Thorpe gave further details of the day, both in his diary and in a long letter which he wrote to his father 2 weeks after the scuttling. He said, the Kestrel was quite big enough to hold us, and we had liberty to go almost all over her. We had the red ensign at the stern, the Union Jack at the bow, and the pennant with the ship's name at the foremast head. We passed through the hurdles, which were the anti-submarine boom defences, and the first German ship we came to was the SMS Baden. She was a battleship having 2 masts and 2 funnels close together, 2 big guns aft and 2 forward. The next was the battlecruiser König Albert. The battlecruisers all have very pointed sterns, and their names are all at the stern instead of at the bow. They have the Kaiser's name on each side, thus, and he writes a big W with a 2 underneath it. The next ships were the battlecruisers Kaiserin, Der Flinger, Hindenburg, von der Tann, Moltke, and Seydlitz. I never noticed the Kaiser or the Karlsruhe. Perhaps I wasn't looking when we passed them. Now, from Leslie Thorpe's narrative, it is clear that the Flying Kestrel sailed south through the part of the flow known as Bring Deeps, and between the lines of the larger German ships lying to the west of the island of Carver. Although they passed very close to the German ships The children had been given strict instructions not to signal or wave to the German sailors or provoke them in any way. Instead, they were encouraged by the headmaster, Mr. Hepburn, to hold a competition to recognize and record as many of the names of the intern ships as they could. Peggy Gibson, a schoolgirl on the Flying Kestrel, recalled it was only when they were sailing down the flow that they were told the British battle squadron had left for torpedo exercises out in the Pentland Firth. The children were rather disappointed. They weren't going to see the British ships, but there was more than enough to occupy their attention as they sailed past the big German battleships and battle cruisers through the line of destroyers moored between Riser and Farah. Leslie Thorpe picks up the story again. These ships lay 2 or 3 side by side. We saw 2 or 3 British destroyers, the Westcott among them. Then we came to a British battleship, HMS Victorious, the base flagship. We passed a floating dock and HMS Imperieuse. We kept on our way past Lyness, where we saw a railway engine running along a light railway. We went on further so as to see 2 hospital ships, Berbice and Agadir. They were beautiful. Then we turned back, intending to go home round the other side of Carver to see the other ships. At this moment, the Flying Kestrel was steaming northwards up Gutter Sound. Captain Davies and his crew had remarked on the absence of the British fleet. They found it strange that the flow was virtually empty of Allied warships. After circling round the Cyclops, the depot ship, the Flying Kestrel began its journey back to Stromness and had travelled about a third of the way through the German fleet when, for the school children, their sightseeing trips suddenly became much more exciting than they could ever have imagined. Admiral von Reuter had issued the preliminary order to stand by at about 10 o'clock in the morning, with the order to scuttle about an hour later. It took time for the message to be passed, the flag message, to be passed around his fleet. And by 11:30 a.m., acknowledgements started to arrive at the flagship SMS Emden. By about 12 noon, the Friedrich der Grosse was seen to be listing and the boats were being lowered. 9-year-old John Tulloch, this is John Tulloch later in life, on the island of Carver, had a marvellous grandstand view of the drama. He watched as the German flag was hoisted on the Friedrich der Grosse, something strictly forbidden by the Allies. A bell began to ring from the battleship Bayern, which began to list to the right further and further until she dropped over on her side, the bows disappearing under the water, and she slid into the flow. He stood in a complete daze, watching what was going on, until he realized that the boats were sinking all round him and the crews were taking to the little rowing boats and rafts and rowing towards his island home, Carver. Seized with panic, he tore off down the track towards his house to alert his family. On the Flying Kestrel, the first inkling that something was wrong was the sight of German sailors putting off from their ships in boats and rafts, and the fact that the big ships were lower in the water. A passing drifter hailed the Flying Kestrel with the message, "The Germans are sinking their ships," and told them to go back to the Victorious for orders. 12-year-old Leslie Thorpe recorded that as the Flying Kestrel returned to the Victorious, quote, "We came alongside with such a bump. We were ordered back to Stromness, and the vessel was then to return to the Victorious. As we came back, we saw one ship bottom up, others turning turtle, and a battle cruiser sinking by the stern, turning over and rapidly going down." Other children remembered particular details of the scuttling. William Groundwater saw sailors dragging their kit across the deck and throwing it into the boats. Rosetta Groundwater saw men with their hands up, one man shot and falling overboard. Peggy Gibson retained a vivid picture of the sea boiling as ships turned turtle, great gouts of water and explosions of steam bursting all around, German sailors being swept into the water and climbing to rafts and boats. She said, "We saw 12 capital ships sinking. Some stood on their bows, Some went over on their sides, and the water was boiling everywhere. The children also witnessed the shooting and the violence that resulted from anger and panic amongst the few British ships on the scene at the time. Leslie Thorpe remembers that one German boat was not showing the white flag, and the destroyer Westcott came up with her guns uncovered and the men holding their rifles ready for action. She fired on the boat with a machine gun, and I heard that a man was killed. And Peggy Gibson records, "We came alongside a trawler that had been picking up German officers for interrogation. They looked very bold. They were sitting ramrod straight and proud, even though the British sailors were training guns on them." Kitty Watt, one of the senior schoolgirls, heard small arms fire too. She watched a drifter towing several boats full of German sailors, quote, "one of whom tried to cut the tow rope and free his boat, whereupon one of the Marine guards on the drifter shot and killed him." According to both the children and British naval officers on the scene, the atmosphere that day was one of, quotes, "pandemonium with a strong dash of panic." There were many others who saw the day's events, although none so close to the ships as the children on the Flying Kestrel were. Arthur Burnett from Grieve House in Stennis was working on a farm at Orfa, overlooking the flow, and he simply couldn't believe what he saw. He'd had a morning working on the land, the sun was hot, and he thought he must have got sunstroke. And so he very carefully, down tools, cycled home and took himself to bed. And then an hour or so later, his mother woke him with the news brought by the postcart that indeed the German ships had been sinking. What he thought was something going wrong with his eyes was in fact the truth. Meanwhile, the first battle squadron had been alerted and rushed back to the flow, with some of the destroyers firing their guns at the German anchor cables, hoping to allow them to drift ashore. But by then, it was too late. Bernard Gribble was a war artist who was up in Scapa Flow aboard the trawler Soccasin, recording the scenes at the time. And he described the chaos and frustration of the British sailors, resulting in several casualties. He recorded the scene, obviously in his sketches, which he turned into two large paintings showing German sailors from the cruiser Frankfurt approaching the trawler in boats and being ordered at gunpoint back to their ships. Boatloads of Germans were now rowing around the anchorage, including Admiral von Reuter, heading for the British ships, especially towards Victorious, where they were assembled on the quarterdeck. The scene was also recorded by C.W. Burrows, cashier of the dockyard section of the naval base, who took pictures and wrote about the event in his book Scapa and a Camera, published in 1921 with some splendid series of pictures in it. And that actually is obviously a destroyer that has been sunk, partially sunk, but at the time of the salvage operation. Only the battleship Baden was reached in time and stabilized. The commanding officer of the Markgraf, Captain Walter Schumann, refused to close seacocks and was shot. Altogether, 9 German sailors lost their lives on the day of the Scuttling, others at other times, and they're buried, as I'm sure some of you know, in the Naval Cemetery at Lyonesse, a poignant reminder of the chaos and drama of that day. By 6 p.m., it was all over. The German fleet had largely sunk into the flow, the last to go being the battlecruiser Hindenburg, which had settled on her keel on a sandbank and remained there for some years, whose masts and funnels above the waterline were a sight to see over the next few years until she was eventually salvaged. But Flotsam and Jetsam continued to float ashore. John Tulloch gives a vivid account of all sorts of wonderful things. Binoculars, there's a rather good set in the Stromness Museum. Binoculars, typewriters, whiskey, uniforms, flags, chocolate, kit bags, all sorts of things arriving on the beach on Carver. Many of these artifacts must have been rescued both at the time and later on during salvage operations. It's a rather good chronometer and a binnacle, which some of you will know from the Stromness Museum. And I guess that within the islands there are still many artifacts and relics of that amazing day left in people's houses. I remember when I came back with my parents in the late 50s and early 60s, my mother still knew many people then, and at one tea party or coffee morning where they were being entertained by friends, my brother and I were given a little brass candle holder, and you've seen many of these both in the Stromness Museum and the Lyoness. And at one tea party or coffee morning where they were being entertained by friends, my brother and I were given a little brass candle holder, and you've seen many of these both in the Stromness Museum and the Lyoness Museum and elsewhere. There must be many still around, and I'm told there are some even down on the wrecks that still remain. But what about the school children aboard the Flying Kestrel? What had happened to them? Well, amidst all the pandemonium, it was hard work for Captain Davies to keep the Flying Kestrel head on to the turbulent waters as he zigzagged back to Stromness. As they went through the boom defences, they saw people on shore waving at them, and the realization dawned that those waiting and watching had been very concerned indeed for them. There was a real worry that they might have been caught up in the downdraft and the ship might even have not survived. So a lot of very anxious relatives and friends. When they arrived back eventually at the pier at Stromness at 2:30, they found the piers were crowded with anxious parents and relatives, making the children feel very important as the only civilian eyewitnesses on the spot of the scuttling. Peggy Gibson remembers, "There was great distress in the town. My parents knew I was out there with my 3 sisters, and every pier in Stromness was lined with people, wondering if the boat with the bairns in would come back." With typical bathos on their arrival home, Peggy Gibson's older sister was far more worried that her hat had blown off during the voyage and fallen into the flow than she was about the momentous events that she'd just witnessed. And Kitty Tate realized that in spite of having packed her favorite orange cream biscuits, they came back uneaten because of all the excitement. While some of the children were thrilled by what they saw, thinking in their naive way that, maybe this had all been laid on for their benefit, a kind of grand show. Others were considerably frightened and anxious and reduced to tears. Peggy Gibson, I think, must have been pretty unfazed. She said, "I remember feeling absolutely amazed that I was there and seeing something that seemed like a display staged just for me. I could hardly believe my eyes." My mother, Winnie Thorpe, Leslie's 9-year-old sister, remembers very distinctly all her life bursting into tears, and her brother, Leslie, putting his arm round her and saying, "Never mind, Winnie, we're witnessing history," which for a 12-year-old was really quite a remarkably profound thing to say. And there's my uncle Leslie's diary, the diary entry for the 21st, the big star. And although it's only got a few lines, it goes on at the back of the book with his full account of the day. Although it's rather interesting, he ends his account, arrived at Stromness about 2:30 after a most thrilling experience. Next paragraph. "I was out all the afternoon in the flatty with the Swannies and later with Willie Mowat. Auntie Tricia called at night, had a game of tennis with Winnie, went a message." There you are. It just sort of, 74 ships gone to the bottom, but life goes on, doesn't it? The events of 21st of June 1919 were never forgotten by those who witnessed them. When interviewed for a magazine article in her 85th year, Peggy Gibson said, "I still think about it. It was really remarkable and not something anyone could easily forget. Seeing those great ships first listing, then sinking, with a great roar of steam escaping, and the German sailors jumping into the water." Well, 100 years on, there are no witnesses left still alive to the events of that day. But through the memories and records they left behind, the drama and chaos and terror of that fateful day can be vividly recreated for later generations, for whom the scuttling of the German high seas fleet is simply part of distant history. Young Leslie Thorpe called his outing on the Flying Kestrel with his sister and the schoolmates a most thrilling experience. And in a PS to his long letter to his father describing their adventures, he added, "Don't you think I'd better write a book about the scuttling of the German fleet?" Well, over the succeeding years, a number of accounts have indeed been written, and this week itself has triggered a fresh spate of publishing. My account is a simple account, very much with those in mind for whom the event is distant history, is largely unknown, and with the hope that through words and pictures they will be introduced to what was an extraordinary event that had repercussions in not just national but international history, and it in a way fulfills that young boy Leslie's aspiration. I'd better write a book, and tells this dramatic story afresh through the eyes of those who saw it happen. As the young Leslie Thorpe said to his sister Winnie at the time, they were indeed witnessing history. Thank you.